Hello, and welcome to a new episode of the Pinnacle Fraudcast. I'm Jean Vorse, Commercial Product Manager for Pinnacle Bank, and I'm here with Julia Suddeth, Treasury Management Manager for Middle Tennessee. Thank you for being with me today, Julia.
Hi, Jean. Thank you for having me.
Great. Today we're going to be talking about check fraud and the things organizations can do to prevent themselves from becoming a victim of check fraud and incurring financial loss. It's no secret that payments fraud and check fraud in particular is becoming a big issue for a lot of organizations these days. In fact, according to data from the Association for Financial Professionals, in 2023, 65% of organizations were victims of check fraud, and 75% of those organizations still use checks to make payments every day. And while check volume continues to decline, 8% over the last 3 years, according to the statistics from the Federal Reserve, reports of fraud, and check fraud in particular, have actually increased in that same time frame. So it isn't a matter of if you're going to become a victim of check fraud, but really when are you going to become a victim of check fraud. So I'm sure, Julia, that you've had a lot of clients that shared with you experiences with check fraud and what happened, what they're doing to prevent it. Maybe you can share some of those experiences and what your clients have done.
Absolutely. Jean, our clients are experiencing check fraud in several different ways. I'm going to share a couple of examples with you today. The first, our client was a victim of counterfeit checks being created on their account. So their account number was obtained illegally. Counterfeit checks were created using desktop scanners and software. Once they created the counterfeit checks, then those checks were mailed along with a letter. So this is part of a mail scheme that we're seeing a lot, is very prevalent today, with checks being sent out with letters of instructions of what the recipient is to do with the funds once they're received. So thankfully, this client already had fraud tools in place on their account. They already have Positive Pay with Payee Match, and so when those checks were presented for payment, the checks were caught in the fraud tool, and they were presented to the client as exception items, and they reviewed them, realized they were fraudulent, and they returned them. So there was no financial impact to the client in this scenario, which was the best scenario
fortunate.
we can have.
Yep.
The second scenario I'd like to share today also includes counterfeit checks as well as identity theft. So we had someone received illegally a check of one of our corporate clients. They created a fake ID for one of the signers, one of the authorized signers on the account. And so they took the fake ID along with the counterfeit check into one of our offices in another state. They attempted, obviously, to cash the check.
Right.
Thankfully, the financial specialist in that office was matching the ID to the ID we have on file. They certainly didn't match, the pictures didn't match, and so she realized immediately that fraud was being attempted. So she certainly didn't cash the check and contacted the financial advisor that works with our client here in our market. So another kind of aside to this scenario is that just recently that financial advisor and their treasury advisor had done a treasury management review with this particular client, and they were encouraging them to implement fraud tools. They didn't decide to do that immediately, but as soon as this incident happened, that was the first thing that they did, is they instituted Positive Pay with Payee Match to prevent this type of fraud. Because if this check had been presented at another institution where they didn't have the ability to check the ID, the likelihood is that that check would have been cashed, it would have been presented against the client account here at Pinnacle, and with no fraud tools in place, the check would have posted with no issues until the client reconciled.
That was a very fortunate case, and it just shows the importance of having those fraud tools, and certainly clients that haven't used them before, as soon as they have fraud, all of a sudden they can't get those fraud tools implemented, quickly enough to protect their accounts.
Exactly. And there are two other types of check fraud that we're seeing very frequently right now. Forged checks, certainly whether it's forging the endorsement on the back of the check or forging even just signatures. Certainly counterfeit checks include forgery because they're forging signatures on those checks. The other is altered checks. So that's where we're seeing Usually just the payee name on the check is washed. There's a technique that the fraudsters use called washing, and they'll wash the payee name and make it payable to themselves or someone that they're using to cash these fraudulent checks. And if you don't utilize the fraud tools appropriately with payee match, when that review happens, the traditional positive pay review is just looking at the check number, the check date, and the check amount, not the payee name. So if you haven't added the payee name in the scenario of washing the name, it would get through the fraud tool.
Right.
So that's why we highly recommend that clients utilize all 4 data points for review in positive pay.
Excellent. Well, we know checks aren't going away anytime soon. I don't think it's realistic. I know we encourage people to move to electronic payments, but short of totally eliminating writing checks, which is, again, not a likelihood in most organizations, what are some actions your clients and organizations, what can they do to help themselves from becoming a victim of check fraud?
Right. You're right, Jean. Paper checks are not going away. They're still an essential payment mode for our clients. But there are ways for our clients to protect themselves and their businesses. The first would be to try to convert as many check payments as possible to an electronic payment mode. So working with your vendors and suppliers to try to convert them to either ACH or card payments will certainly help decrease the number of checks that are being issued. One thing as a recipient, or as you're being requested to send payment electronically, be willing to do that as well. Because if you're asking your clients to do that, then in turn be willing to accept payments electronically to try to help reduce the number of checks on both sides. We do understand that clients are hesitant to give their bank account information to a third party. However, it's important to note that every time you send a check out the door, you're sending out your bank account information.
Exactly.
You're exposing that bank information
Exactly.
to whoever receives that check, and it could be received fraudulently, which is what we're talking about today. But we want to also make sure clients understand that if they do allow third parties to draft their account via ACH for payments rather than them sending a check payment, is that there are fraud tools that help protect against ACH fraud on the account. Another thing that you can do with the rise in mail theft, whether it's from a mailbox that's at your business or if it's a true post office box, a freestanding post office box, is take your check payments into the post office and rather than putting them in a mailbox to be picked up by the mail carrier. That would be certainly a recommendation that we would make. We also encourage clients to consider using lockbox services, which that's an outsourcing tool for accounts receivable processing. In this scenario, it helps mitigate checks being intercepted, in transit, because the bank will actually pick up those checks at the mail facility, not at a true P.O. box. We're going to be picking those up at the mail facility before any mail is sorted down to any of the local post offices. And certainly utilize the fraud tools that your bank offers. There are so many different ways that we can help clients, certainly positive pay, to track the checks that are coming in, and utilizing payee match, because that's what we talked about earlier. It can detect whether or not an altered payee name has been altered. The other thing is, if you have accounts that you do not disperse checks, they're deposit-only accounts, include a check block or a post no checks notation to these accounts, so that way you're not opening that account up to paper check fraud.
Great. I know, Julie, that some check fraud is really hard to detect. Forged endorsement, missing endorsement, where some of these tools that we were talking about aren't going to catch it. Pay match positive pay or something like that won't catch it. So what are other things organizations should be doing to help mitigate the possibility of becoming a victim of that type of fraud that's a little harder to detect or during processing?
Absolutely. If possible, as we kind of talked about earlier, converting to electronic payments, and maybe you do that with a large dollar threshold. That may make more sense that you would do, rather than sending checks for large dollar payments, that you send those electronically. If you do have to send a check for large dollar amounts, make sure it's traceable and you're using some type of tracking mechanism. Another thought would be that you have a practice of confirming receipt of large dollar checks so that you're in communication with the client and make sure that they have received that check. Jean, I think that the days have long passed that clients could reconcile accounts at month end or at statement cycle end, whether it's really personally or your business. We encourage clients to reconcile their accounts daily. I know that sounds like a lot, but at a minimum, we would recommend that they review their account activity on a daily basis if they don't do a full reconciliation. Timely identification of fraud is essential to having a chance to recoup any funds that are lost due to fraud.
Exactly. Great advice, Julia. Thank you for joining me today, Julia. Great conversation on check fraud, and thank you, listeners, for joining us as well, for tuning in. And for more helpful information for how to protect your organization from fraud, please visit www.pnfp.com/fraud center. Thank you.